Similarly, the amendment process. They were wise enough to realize that they didn't have all the answers and that some things would change. A good example of this is something like slavery or civil rights. It's an embarrassing thing to admit, but the people who wrote the Constitution did not understand that slavery was a bad thing and did not respect civil rights. And yet they created a framework so that as the generations came to understand that that was important, they could write that into the Constitution too and ensure true equal protection for all of us.
So what you just saw there was Pete Buttigieg making the argument that America's founding fathers did not know slavery was wrong or a bad thing, and yet they helped build a constitutional framework which eventually allowed for the abolition of slavery and other positive reforms. And I just have to say that Pete Buttigieg is wholly wrong here. It's really quite astounding how wrong he is. Let's be clear, not only is this a man running for president, and so I feel should have a better grasp of American history, but specifically, Pete Buttigieg has put so much on his elite, profound education, and many of Buttigieg's supporters have made such a great deal of the fact that he's highly educated, very worldly, very well-read, and on and on and on. Pete Buttigieg took many history courses at Harvard University, which is, of course, one of the greatest universities, not just in the United States, but in the world. So it's really quite troubling to see Pete Buttigieg, of all people, make this argument. At the end of the day, there are so many examples that you could use to prove Pete Buttigieg wrong here, but there are a few key ones that we really have to hammer home in trying to understand how many of the founding fathers understood slavery was wrong, some of whom were abolitionists, and some of whom understood it was wrong, but still went through with the institution anyway. At the end of the day, abolitionism, basically the movement to abolish slavery, existed in both Britain and the United States before the Revolution, and existed in many ways throughout the 17 and early 1800s. Some of the founding fathers, like Ben Franklin, were abolitionists. They weren't just neutral on the institution of slavery, they were actually, vigorously opposed to the institution. Early drafts of the Declaration of Independence by people like Thomas Jefferson understood that slavery was a poor institution, that it was a blight on American society. Now, he blamed the British for it, for imposing it as colonial masters. But at the end of the day, he understood that slavery was wrong, that slavery was going to be this millstone around the legacy of this young republic. Now, of course, Jefferson owned slaves. Jefferson owned slaves his entire life. Ben Franklin owned slaves for a point in his life, but the point was, many of these early founding fathers deeply understood that slavery was a blight to the individual liberty that the American Revolution supposedly represented. That if you really believe that all men are created equal, that there's this divine, right that every human being has to basic liberty, then many people understood that the existence of slavery within the 13 colonies was at the very least a serious contradiction. Now, some of those people said, notwithstanding that, we're going to have slavery because the economic value is too important. Some people wanted to have slavery because it was felt it was the only way to link all 13 colonies, that if, the northern states took an abolitionist tone, then, the southern states would not join. That would lead to two separate states in opposition to the British, which would be weaker. Maybe it would allow the British to launch a successful counter-revolution. And so it was felt that in many ways, you needed to have various compromises that allowed anti-slave and pro-slave forces to form a functioning country. And again, the reason these compromises even existed was because many of the founding fathers and many of the people in the United States at the time understood that slavery was wrong. They weren't necessarily believers in political equality and racial equality for black people or for non-white people. Many of them weren't. Many of them felt that, regardless of slavery, there was racial superiority hierarchies. But there were various things in the Constitution, like the banning of the slave trade in the Northwest, like the Three-Fifths Compromise, like various other forms of legislation that basically allowed that country to form, that understood that many of the people that were at these debates, at the founding of the American nation, at the founding of the Republic, understood slavery was wrong. They did. But that it needed to be preserved, from their perspective at least, to build the Republic. And that's why you have the Three-Fifths Compromise, which basically helped to give the southern states more weight by counting, slaves as 3/5 of a person. That's where this comes from. Not because they were given 3/5 of a vote. They were, of course, given no vote. But that it would give political weight to the white people in those states based upon the amount of slaves held in those states. It was a big compromise. That was part of the deal. It was also part of the deal that the slave trade, the international slave trade, and various other forms of, the exportation of slaves and importation of slaves would not be impeded at the beginning of the Republic. But 20 years after, it could be. And in basic terms, many Americans moved as quickly as they could to restrict the slave trade in international terms. Now, some people have suggested this is a clear sign that as much as people could, they wanted to restrict the slave trade, because even many of the founders understood that the slave trade was abhorrent. But some people have also suggested that this was a move to empower the existing slaveholding class in the United States, because if you're not allowed to export or import slaves, then effectively what you have is a monopoly on the existing people who own slaves, because the only way to get new slaves was through natural reproduction. You couldn't just import them from Africa or the Caribbean or what have you anymore. That was the reality, though, is that all of these fights were incredibly important. They were happening in and around the foundation of this new country. In many ways, slavery was, a principal debating topic during these early, negotiations between the 13 colonies about what their potential union would look like. And the reason, again, that it was a discussion at all was because at least some of the founding fathers knew slavery was wrong. So wrong that it needed to be abolished then, or at least wrong from a moral and, ideological perspective, if not from an economic and pragmatic perspective. That's a key factor here. It's also important to go forward in history a little bit. There was the cornerstone speech by a Confederate vice president in the early 1860s. And this speech is seen as one of the key moments in underlining that the Confederate separation, that their departure from the United States was not about states' rights, but about the fundamental preservation of slavery and the inequality between white people and non-white people. That's what this was about. And the cornerstone speech makes it clear that the founding fathers were wrong. And the founding fathers were wrong because too many of them actually felt racial equality could one day become a thing. The argument from this vice president was that the founding fathers saw slavery as an evil. They saw it as something that would plague the American Republic. But for various reasons, they didn't know how to deal with it. That even the people that supported abolition didn't see a political path forward at the time. So they sort of kept the institution, and at times there were restrictions on it. In the South, it continued to expand, and this would eventually lead in many ways towards increased conflict and the Civil War in the 1860s, where at the conclusion of that war, slavery would be abolished. But the Confederates argued that the founding fathers had a misconception, and that because the races are fundamentally unequal, slavery is not evil and is thus morally justified. And so in many ways, a lot of historians have argued that while there were certainly slaveholding supporters among the founding fathers and among those early revolutionaries, at the end of the day, the moral justifications of slavery were found less from the founding fathers and more from later generations of Americans that wanted to preserve the institution of slavery in light of growing abolition movements, in light of the North becoming increasingly anti-slavery, in light of the world becoming increasingly anti-slavery, in light of the fact that there was a revolution in Haiti, and in light of the fact that there was, the British Empire banning, slavery in the 1830s, with all the caveats therein, they still sort of banned slavery. At the end of the day, the growing desire from pro-slavery forces in the United States was to make moral arguments more in the 1840s and 50s than in the 1770s and 80s and 90s, although arguments about the morality of slavery probably were not absent in the, earlier years. But the whole point here is that Pete Buttigieg is wrong. This is a man who should know better. This is a man who should understand the nuance of American history. This is a man who should not try to literally and figuratively whitewash a key debate within the early American Republic because it sort of serves his political narrative. Pete Buttigieg either knows better and he's trying to make a political point here to defend the Founding Fathers despite them knowing what they did was wrong and doing it anyway, or he doesn't know what he's talking about, and this is a real indictment of a man who is supposedly where he is in part because he's so worldly and educated and has deep, nuanced perspectives driven in part by that education. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable to have this viewpoint. You don't have to take a definitive side. There were probably some Founding Fathers and some early American revolutionary leaders who thought slavery was a good thing, or at least wasn't a bad thing. There were probably some, but there were many, including people who held slaves, who thought that slavery was an evil institution that for whatever reason had to be part of that early republic. And there were yet still people who, if it was up to them, would have abolished slavery upon the revolution being over. There were various debates happening. And so Pete Buttigieg sort of just levels all of that, getting rid of the important nuance of history and not holding to account some of America's earliest leaders who knew they were doing evil and did evil anyway.